Sometimes the only way to keep your soul is to let them think they've already taken it. The night her stepfather handed her over, it was raining so hard the gutters overflowed onto the sidewalk, and Lena stood in the middle of it all with her one good coat soaking through, watching a man she'd called Dad for 11 years count a stack of bills into another man's hands. She didn't cry. She'd stopped crying around the same time she stopped expecting things to get better. Somewhere between her mother's funeral and the first time her stepfather, Boyd, had mortgaged the apartment without telling anyone. She was 23 years old and she had $42 in her checking account and a notebook full of numbers that proved, down to the decimal, exactly how badly Boyd had ruined all of them. She just didn't know yet that the numbers were about to save her life. The man receiving the money didn't look the way she'd imagined. She'd built up some image in her head on the drive over. Thick neck, cheap suit, gold chain, the kind of man who collected debts for sport. Instead, Kellner was standing beneath the awning of a building she'd never seen before, a glass and steel structure on the edge of the financial district that had no signage, no logo, nothing to indicate what happened inside. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat, no tie, collar open one button. His hair was black going silver at the temples. He had a scar that ran from his left jaw down to where his collar hid it, and he looked at Boyd the way someone looks at a late fee, mildly irritating, already accounted for. He didn't look at Lena at all. Boyd was talking. He was always talking, filling silence the way a cracked pipe fills a wall. Slowly, invisibly, until everything is rotten. He was saying something about the debt, about how this was more than fair, about how Lena was smart, she was good with numbers, she'd be useful. Lena watched Kellner's face while Boyd talked. Nothing moved, not his jaw, not his eyes. The rain came down between them, and Boyd kept going, and Kellner just waited. Then Boyd said, "She doesn't cause trouble. She knows how to keep her mouth shut." And for the first time, Kellner looked at her. It wasn't the way men usually looked at her, which was either through her or at the parts of her they thought she didn't notice. This was something else. A calculation, rapid and impersonal, the kind of assessment she'd seen CPAs make when handed a balance sheet for the first time. He was looking for something specific. She didn't know what. She made herself hold his gaze because she was not going to look at the ground. She was not. He said, without any particular inflection, "Can you read a ledger?" she said. "I've been correcting yours for 3 weeks." Boyd made a strangled sound beside her. Kellner looked at her for another 2 seconds. Then something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, nothing so warm as that, but a small tightening at the corner of his mouth, like a man who has just found an unexpected entry in a column he thought was empty. "Put her in the East Wing," he said to someone behind him. And just like that, Lena was no longer standing in the rain. The East Wing of whatever this place was turned out to be a set of rooms on the 4th floor with a window that faced a courtyard and a desk that was better than any she'd ever owned. There was a bathroom with actual hot water pressure. There was a bed with a frame. She sat on the edge of it that first night, with her wet coat spread over the chair, and her notebook open on her knees, and she did what she always did when she didn't know what else to do. She wrote down everything she knew. Boyd owed Kellner's organization $412,000. She knew this because Boyd was an idiot, who left his email open on the shared laptop, and because she had, over the years, developed a very particular skill for understanding money. Not in the abstract, the way people talk about it at dinner parties, but in the concrete, the flow and drain of it, where it came from, and where it went, and what the gap between those two things meant for everyone involved. Her mother had been an accountant before the illness. Some things passed down. The debt was real. The arrangement, whatever it was real. What wasn't clear yet was what Kellner actually wanted from her, because men like Boyd made promises without understanding what they were promising. And she had been delivered as an asset without a clear accounting of what that asset was supposed to do. She found out the next morning. A woman named Sable, 40s, silver-streaked locks, the particular posture of someone who has not been surprised in a very long time, came to her room at 7 and said, "Kellner wants you in the operations office at 8. You'll be auditing the freight accounts." Lena said, "Freight accounts?" Sable said, "You have a problem with that." Lena said, "I have a problem with incomplete information. What am I auditing for?" Sable looked at her. "Theft from inside or outside, does it matter? It matters for the methodology." Something shifted in Sable's face. Not quite respect, but the precursor to it. She said, "Someone on the payroll has been skimming." "We don't know who. The amounts are small, which means whoever it is knows enough to stay below the threshold. Kellner wants it found." Lena closed her notebook. "How long has it been going on?" "We think 14 months, and none of your people caught it. Our people are good at other things." Lena stood up. "I'll need full access to the freight ledgers, the payroll cross-referenced against shipping dates, and a list of everyone who had authorization to adjust the outgoing receipts." Sable didn't move for a moment. Then she said, "You're not scared." "I'm terrified," Lena said. "I'm also broke and I haven't had a job with real accounts in 8 months because Boyd kept borrowing from anyone who hired me. I can be scared and still work. Those aren't mutually exclusive." Sable almost smiled. 8 o'clock, she said, and left. The operations office was on the 2nd floor, and it smelled like coffee and printer ink, and something under that she couldn't quite name. Something cold and metallic that had seeped into the walls over years of whatever happened in buildings like this. There were 6 people at workstations when she walked in. None of them looked up. That was fine. She wasn't there to be looked at. The freight accounts were a disaster. Not obviously. That was the point. It was never obvious when someone knew what they were doing. But underneath the surface tidiness there was a pattern, and patterns were the thing Lena had always been able to see. It was the way some people could hear a song once and know all the notes, or the way certain people walked into a room and immediately understood the social geometry. For Lena, numbers had texture, and these numbers had a seam running through them, a hairline fracture in the logic that someone had tried to smooth over by spreading the discrepancies across 17 different line items over 14 months. She found it in 4 hours. She was still staring at the screen, 3 pages of notes beside her, when she became aware of someone standing at the edge of the workspace. She didn't look up. She said, "Whoever it is, it's the same person every time. The adjustments always happen on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of the month, and they always correspond to the northern route shipments, and they're always just under the internal review threshold, by amounts ranging from 6 to 11%. That's not luck. That's someone who's read the compliance manual." A pause. Then, "How much in total?" She looked up. Kellner was standing with his arms at his sides and his coat over one arm, and he was watching her with that same expression from the rain, not warmth, not cold, just attention, focused and complete. She said, $63,420. Over 14 months. Whoever it is wasn't greedy. They planned to do this for years. Kellner said, "You're sure?" She turned her notebook toward him. "Page 1 is the pattern. Page 2 is the cross-reference against the payroll authorization list. Page 3 is the 5 people who match the access profile. I've circled 2 of them because the other 3 have alibis built into the timesheets, which," she paused, because she was about to say something that probably wasn't her place, which, incidentally, suggests either very good luck on their part or someone helped them establish those alibis, and if it's the second thing, then the problem is bigger than one person skimming freight accounts. The silence stretched. She waited. She was good at waiting. She'd had a lot of practice. Kellner pulled out a chair, turned it backward, and sat down across from her. He was closer than she'd expected, and she made herself not lean back. He said, "You do this in 4 hours. I've been doing books since I was 15. My mother taught me." She paused. "I also haven't eaten since yesterday, so my focus might be declining." It came out before she'd fully decided to say it, and she watched something cross his face. A brief, unguarded thing that was there and gone before she could name it. He turned and said something quietly to the man standing near the door. 5 minutes later, a plate appeared at her elbow. He said, "Who taught you the threshold methodology?" "No one. I just noticed that every audit system has a review floor. And if you're patient and you know the floor, you can dance just below it indefinitely. I wrote a paper about it in college. My professor told me it was too cynical for academic publication. She looked at the plate. Eggs, toast, something that smelled like actual coffee. And she was hungrier than she'd realized. Do you want me to keep working, or are we doing introductions? Keep working, Kellner said. He stayed for 2 hours. He didn't speak again except twice, once to ask about a specific notation she'd made, once to tell her the name she'd circled first was correct, that they'd found corroborating evidence through a different channel. He left without explanation or ceremony. She thought about that after, the way he'd stayed but not hovered, like a man who understood that surveillance and presence were different things. She'd been watched before, by Boyd, by creditors, by landlords, waiting to see if she'd bounce. And it always had a particular quality, a tightening of the air. Kellner's presence didn't tighten anything. She didn't understand that yet. She filed it under things to think about later and went back to the numbers. The weeks that followed had a structure she didn't expect. She had access to the accounts, freight, payroll, properties, a series of shell companies whose purpose she understood at a conceptual level without needing it explained, and her job, it became clear, was to be the thing the organization apparently hadn't had before, someone whose sole function was to find the cracks before they became fractures. Kellner's people were good at operations, at logistics, at the physical management of whatever moved through the northern routes, and the 3 warehouses she was not notably invited to visit. What they were not good at was paperwork in the forensic sense. They tracked money the way people track weather, roughly, with attention to major events, missing the small, daisy shifts that accumulated into something significant. She tracked the small things. That was the job. And the job, whatever else it was real work, and she was good at it, and that counted for something when everything else was uncertain. Boyd came once, about 3 weeks in. She didn't know he'd been allowed into the building until she looked up from her desk, and he was standing in the doorway of the operations office, looking prosperous in a new jacket, wearing the expression he always wore when he thought a situation had gone better than expected for him. He said, "See? This worked out fine. You've got a good setup here." She said, "You sold me to cover a gambling debt." He said, "It's not like that." She said, "Boyd, I've read every contract you've signed with this organization going back 4 years. I know exactly what it's like." His face went through several phases. Then he said, "I'm your family." She said, "My mother was my family. She's been dead for 6 years, and you spent her insurance payout in 18 months and then started borrowing against my wages. You should leave before I finish this sentence." He left. She sat very still for a moment after. The way you sit after something you've held for a long time finally puts itself down. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. She and Kellner developed. She didn't have a word for it exactly. A rhythm, maybe. He reviewed her findings every Thursday, usually in the late afternoon, in an office on the 3rd floor that had a view of the city and very few personal objects. She would present the week's audit. He would ask questions that were always more specific than she expected. She would answer them, and then they would sometimes talk. Not in the way people at cocktail parties talk, performing openness, but in a blunt and practical way that felt more honest than most conversations she'd had. She learned he'd taken over the organization at 31 under circumstances he described only as a vacancy. He ran it the way he ran everything, as a system of accounts, debts incurred and paid, obligations tracked and discharged. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't pretend it was something other than what it was. He said once, matter-of-factly, "I'm not a good man. I know that. I've made my peace with it." She said, "I'm not sure that's true." He said, "Which part?" "The peace part." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You're perceptive." "It's the same skill," she said, "finding what doesn't add up." What didn't add up was this: a man who had built an organization on calculated self-interest, who also, apparently, ran a medical fund for the families of employees killed on the job, who kept a running account she'd found tucked inside the operational ledgers, small amounts monthly, to 12 separate individuals she'd cross-referenced, and found to be the children of men who had died in his employ. Who paid those amounts under a company name that didn't connect back to him in any traceable way? She didn't mention it the first week she found it, or the second. On the third week, she put the ledger page on the desk between them and pointed to it without saying anything. He said, "You weren't supposed to find that." She said, "I find everything," he said. "I know." A pause. "Does it change your assessment?" She said. "Of the accounts or of you?" He said, "Either." She thought about it seriously, because he was asking seriously. The accounts are well structured. Whoever set them up understood plausible deniability, but also clearly cared that the money actually arrived. There's a follow-up notation system I've never seen before. You track whether the payment's clear, whether they're cashed, and there are 3 instances where an amount was doubled because you found out the family was facing a medical crisis. She paused. That's not a system built for appearances. That's a system built by someone who checks. Kellner was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father didn't leave anything to the people who worked for him. When he died, 14 families had nothing." She said, "So you do." He said, "It doesn't make me a good man." She said, "No, but it makes you a more complicated one than you're advertising." Something changed between them after that. Incrementally, the way things change in a ledger when a series of small entries tips the balance from red to black. She stopped bracing when he came into the office. He stopped pretending he was only there for the reports. They ate lunch in that 3rd-floor office on Thursdays after the audit, and she started leaving her coat on his chair because she was always cold, and it was always there. He started leaving the window cracked because he'd noticed she liked the sound of the city. Neither of them said anything about any of it. The trouble came from outside. She knew something was wrong before anyone told her, because the accounts shifted, a particular kind of shift she'd started to recognize, where money moved from operational accounts into liquid reserves, which meant the organization was bracing for something it expected to cost more than it could easily absorb. She'd seen similar patterns in corporate receivables when companies knew litigation was coming. The mechanism was different, but the instinct was the same. She asked Sable. Sable said, "Rival faction. They've been trying to take the northern routes for 2 years. They think now is a good time to move." Lena said, "Why now?" Sable looked at her steadily. "Because word got out that Kellner's brought in a civilian. Some people think that means he's distracted." She said, I'm not. I know what you are," Sable said, "and he knows what you are. The problem is other people's interpretations." She went back to the accounts, and she worked faster than she'd ever worked, pulling every reserve and contingency fund she could find into a consolidated picture. What they actually had, what was truly liquid, what could be moved if necessary, what was tied up in assets that couldn't be touched without attracting the wrong kind of attention. She had it done by midnight, and she took it to Kellner's office without being asked. He was still there. He was usually still there. She put the consolidated report on his desk and stood back. He read it. He turned pages. He read it again. Then he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the calculation, not the contained focus, but something rawer. Something that had to do with the hour and the situation, and the fact that she'd done this without being told. He said, "You didn't have to do this tonight." She said, "I know." He said, "Why did you?" She looked at him across the desk, and she was tired, and she'd been scared for 3 weeks, and she was still not going to look at the floor. She said, "Because this is mine now. The accounts are mine. I found every crack in them, and I sealed them, and I know where every number comes from. You don't get to let someone dismantle that." A long pause. He said very quietly, "This isn't your fight." She said, "According to whose ledger?" He stood up from behind the desk. He was tall enough that the office rearranged around him when he moved, and she'd stopped noticing that weeks ago, but she noticed it now. He crossed to where she was standing, and he looked at her, and she looked back, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way you handle something you know has been damaged and aren't sure how much it can bear. He said, "When this is over, what?" He said, "I'd like to renegotiate the arrangement." She said, The arrangement. He said, "The one Boyd made, the one that brought you here." A pause. "I'd like to make a different one, between us." Directly, she looked at their hands. She thought about 14 months of a man skimming freight accounts, the patience required to stay just below the threshold. She thought about 12 children whose benefit payments were verified by hand every month. She thought about a plate of eggs that appeared at her elbow before she'd finished asking. She said, "What terms?" He said, "Owns you agreed to," she said. "I'll want that in writing." Something happened in his face that was definitively a smile. "Not large, but real," she said, "and I'll want full access to the consolidated accounts. Not just freight," he said. "You already have it," she said. "I know, I want it formally," he said. "Done." She looked at him. She thought, I have been handed off like a debt, like a line item, like something Boyd needed to clear from his books. I have been cold and hungry, and I have sat on a bed in a strange room and written down everything I knew because that was the only thing I could do. And now this man is standing here asking me to write a new entry, and the ledger is open, and the pen is in my hand. She said, "All right, Kellner." He said, "Evan." She said, "I'll think about it." He laughed, actually laughed, brief and quiet, like he'd forgotten he knew how, and she felt the sound of it rearrange something in her chest that had been arranged the wrong way for a very long time. The rival faction moved 3 days later. It was not the cataclysm anyone had feared. It turned out the consolidated report she'd built had identified 3 reserve channels the organization hadn't been properly accounting for, and Kellner had used that information to quietly reinforce 2 positions that the rival faction had assumed were weak. When the move came, it landed in the wrong place. The numbers had done what numbers do when handled correctly. They told the truth, and the truth had a sharper edge than anything else in the room. Afterwards, Sable found Lena in the operations office running post-incident reconciliations and said, "You know what you did." Lena said, "I balanced a ledger." Sable said, "You turned a potential disaster into a miscalculation on their end. You understand that?" Lena said, "I found what didn't add up." Sable looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "He hasn't laughed in about 4 years, just so you know," and walked out. Boyd came back 2 weeks later. She'd known he would. Boyd always came back when he sensed stability, the way certain animals return to places where they've successfully fed before. He was standing in the lobby of the building when she came down from the operations office, and he had a new story ready. She could tell from 20 feet away by the way he was holding his jacket, a kind of rehearsed casualness. He said, "I wanted to check in, see how things were going." She said, "Things are going well." He said, "Good, good." I was thinking, now that you're settled, maybe we could talk about." She said, "Boyd." He stopped. She said, "I've been here long enough to understand what this organization can do for people who try to extract value from it through people who live inside it." A pause. "I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you information the way I give everyone information." He looked at it. "Is your business." He looked at her for a long time. She watched him try to find the girl who had stood in the rain with $42 and a soaked coat. She watched him not find her. He said, "You've changed." She said, "I've always been exactly this. You just didn't look." He left. She didn't watch him go. The arrangement Kellner had proposed took 2 weeks to negotiate, because she was thorough about contracts the way she was thorough about everything, and because she wanted terms that said what they meant, not terms that could be reinterpreted when circumstances changed. Kellner negotiated without impatience. He pushed back twice on specifics, once on a clause she'd written about financial autonomy, once on something she'd included about terms of exit, and both times he pushed back with reasons, not pressure. She revised the autonomy clause and kept the exit clause unchanged, and he accepted both without argument. She signed it on a Thursday after the audit, in the 3rd floor office with the city outside. He signed it after her and put the pen down and said, "For what it's worth, I knew when you looked at me in the rain." She said, "Knew what?" He said, "That you were going to be the most expensive thing that ever happened to me." She looked at him. She said, "Is that a complaint?" He said, "No, it's an accurate accounting." She picked up her coat from his chair, where she'd left it, and she thought about expensive things and accurate accountings, and the particular weight of a ledger that finally, after years of other people writing the entries, had her name at the top. She said, "Evan." He looked up. She said, "Good deal." Outside the window, the city moved through its own enormous accounting, all those lives adding and subtracting against each other, all that invisible math, and inside the office, two people who had both learned to read the numbers stood in the balance of what they'd built from the ruins of what someone else had tried to destroy, and the books, for the first time in a long time, came out even.